He woke up every morning certain of one thing: the world had changed overnight. Sometimes the walls of his room felt too close, as if shrinking in to suffocate him. Other times they expanded endlessly, stretching into a hallway that didn't exist the day before. Yet, when his wife entered, everything appeared normal again. The coffee smelled real. The sunlight looked warm. The only problem was that both worlds felt equally true, Dr. Rehan. Malik was a neuroscientist who understood the brain better than most. He had spent years studying how the mind constructs reality, how the flicker of electrical impulses and chemicals could convince us of anything. Ironically, it was his own brain that turned against him. It began with small distortions: hearing someone call his name when no one was there, seeing his reflection blink a second too late. He brushed it off as fatigue. But over time, he started living between two versions of life, both as detailed and convincing as the other. In one version, he was the same calm, rational scientist, teaching, researching, and caring for his family. In the other, everything was subtly wrong. His wife's voice would change tone. His students would stare too long, their eyes vacant, like masks that only pretended to be human. Streets looked slightly misaligned, as if reality itself had been rearranged by unseen hands. When he reached for the door handle of his lab, sometimes it was there, sometimes it wasn't. Rehan's experience wasn't supernatural. It was neurological. His brain had begun processing the world in two conflicting ways. It wasn't that one version was real and the other imagined. Both were real to him. His neurons fired with equal conviction in both states. What he didn't know was that he was experiencing what psychiatrists describe as dual perception. When the mind can maintain two competing models of reality at once, to understand Rehan's suffering, you have to understand how fragile the brain's perception machinery is. The world we see is not the world as it is. It's the world our brain interprets. Our senses collect fragments of light, sound, and texture, but it's the brain that assembles them into meaning. That process usually happens seamlessly. But when something goes wrong, a disruption in the brain's electrical patterns, trauma, or chemical imbalance, the mind can start producing parallel versions of reality. This is where science meets mystery. Researchers studying patients with dissociative or delusional disorders often find that their brains show conflicting activity between the sensory areas and the frontal lobes. It's like two directors trying to shoot the same film, each with a different script. The result isn't chaos at first. It's a quiet confusion that grows until the person can no longer tell which version of the story is true. In Rehan's case, his right temporal lobe, the part that helps integrate emotional memory, was overactive. That meant every dream, every anxious thought, every faint suggestion could start feeling as real as what he actually experienced. When he dreamed of someone following him the next day, he could see that figure in the corner of his eye. The brain doesn't need physical proof to believe. It just needs convincing patterns of activity. What makes this phenomenon even more tragic is that the brain does not warn us when it's lying. When you touch something hot, pain tells you to move. But when your mind distorts reality, it gives no signal that says, this isn't real. The illusion feels just as convincing as the truth. That's why people experiencing psychosis or hallucinations often insist on what they see or hear. Their brains are simply running a different program, one they cannot distinguish from the original. For Rehan, the divide between his two realities began to deepen. One day, while giving a lecture on perception, he noticed the audience vanish mid-sentence. The hall turned into his old childhood home. The chalk in his hand became a toy he hadn't seen in years. His mind had switched worlds instantly and completely. And then, as he blinked, he was back in the lecture hall, students staring, waiting for him to continue. To them, nothing had happened. To him, minutes had passed elsewhere. That night, he recorded what he was experiencing. If the brain believes something, he said into his voice recorder, doesn't that make it real, at least to the person living it? It was a haunting question, and one that neuroscience has yet to fully answer. We like to think reality is objective, but it's only as stable as the brain that perceives it. In clinical studies, patients with conditions like Capgras syndrome report believing their loved ones have been replaced by imposters. Their visual processing is intact. They recognize the face, but the emotional link to familiarity is broken. The result is a logical mind that sees the correct image but feels something is wrong. Their brain believes two realities. This looks like my wife, and this is not my wife. Both feel true. That same cognitive dissonance defined Rehan's days, except his entire world was split that way. Scientists explain this through a concept called neural coherence. The brain relies on synchronized communication between different regions to maintain a unified sense of self and reality. When that coherence falters due to stress, trauma, or neurological disorders, the integration collapses. Think of it like two radio stations broadcasting at once. Sometimes you hear one clearly, sometimes the other, and sometimes both together. That noise was Rehan's everyday life. He tried grounding exercises, cognitive tests, and even self-hypnosis. Some days, he succeeded in staying in one world long enough to function normally. Other days, he drifted between them without control. His wife watched helplessly as he argued with people who weren't there, or wrote detailed notes about events no one else remembered. The tragedy wasn't that he was hallucinating. It was that both realities made perfect sense to him. There's an educational truth in Rehan's story. The human brain is not a camera recording reality, but a storyteller constructing it. Each second, billions of neurons interpret, compare, and decide what is true. When that system breaks down, even the most logical mind can believe in two truths at once. It's a sobering reminder that consciousness itself is not fixed. It's fragile, adaptive, and constantly rewriting its script. By the time Rehan sought medical help, he wasn't looking to be cured. He wanted to understand how his brain could deceive him so completely. During his MRI scans, doctors observed fluctuating neural activity across his visual and limbic systems. Patterns similar to patients in dream states, except Rehan was awake. His brain had essentially created a waking dream. It's an alternate perceptual map that he could access as easily as reality. He wrote in his journal, "Maybe we don't lose touch with reality. Maybe the brain just creates too many versions of it, and we get stuck between them." And in that single line lay the essence of the human mind, a powerful machine capable of both reason and illusion. Logic and madness, often in the same breath. The story of the brain that believed two realities is not just Rehan's. It's a mirror held up to all of us. Every belief, every assumption, every fear we hold is a version of reality constructed inside our heads. The question is not whether the brain can believe two realities. The question is, how many do we live with every day without even realizing it? The brain is an incredible storyteller. It doesn't just collect facts. It weaves them together into something that makes sense, something it can live with. That's why when reality doesn't fit the story, the brain doesn't stop believing. It rewrites the story instead. For Dr. Rehan Malik, that rewriting happened silently, like edits made in the dark. He would remember events slightly differently from others, and when those memories were questioned, he didn't feel wrong. He felt misunderstood. His brain had chosen the version that made sense to him. What he didn't know was that this was his mind's desperate attempt to maintain coherence. The feeling that life follows a logical, continuous pattern. Neuroscientists call this the consistency principle. The brain cannot tolerate chaos. When presented with information that conflicts with what it already believes, it tries to resolve the difference, either by adjusting the facts or inventing new ones. It's a process that keeps us sane, but it can also deceive us. In healthy minds, this process helps us ignore minor contradictions, like when we overlook the slight differences between two photos of the same scene. But in an unstable or stressed brain, this mechanism can go too far, creating entire false memories or realities that the person then defends with absolute conviction. Rehan's lectures on cognitive dissonance had once been purely academic. He used to explain to his students how Leon Festinger's 1957 theory described the mental discomfort people feel when holding to conflicting beliefs. Like when someone knows smoking is harmful, but continues to smoke, convincing themselves it reduces stress. But now, Rehan wasn't just teaching the theory. He was living it. His rational mind, trained in science and logic, knew something was wrong. His other mind, the emotional and defensive one, couldn't bear the idea that his senses might be lying. So his brain did what every brain does. It built a bridge between those contradictions. It told him a new story, one that could include both truths. If a sound came from an empty hallway, he didn't question whether it existed. His brain explained it away. Maybe someone was outside. Maybe it was the pipes. When his reflection blinked out of sync, he decided it must be the light. Every time something didn't fit, his brain filled the gap. The goal wasn't accuracy. It was stability. The mind doesn't crave truth as much as it craves coherence. Inside the brain, this balancing act happens across several regions. The prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for decision-making and reasoning, constantly works to organize incoming information, suppressing anything that doesn't fit the dominant narrative. Meanwhile, the limbic system, the emotional center, colors those perceptions with feeling, deciding which version feels right. When these two regions fall out of sync, perception fractures. The person might still think clearly, but the emotional certainty that supports logic disappears. Rehan's Mr. I scans later revealed irregular activity in both areas. His prefrontal cortex was overcompensating, working overtime to maintain logical order, while his limbic system kept triggering fear responses to things that weren't there. It was as if one part of his brain was trying to stay rational, while another was insisting something was deeply wrong. Both sides believed they were protecting him. That's the strange beauty of the human mind, even when it lies. It does so with good intentions. The brain edits reality to protect the self. It hides pain, softens trauma, and fills memory gaps so that life continues to make sense. But when those edits multiply, the narrative starts to tear. Rehan began noticing inconsistencies that no explanation could fix. His wife would remind him of conversations he didn't remember having. His colleagues mentioned papers he was sure he hadn't written. His mind was no longer a single author. It had become a committee of competing editors, each rewriting reality in its own voice. This is what happens when coherence becomes more important than truth. Psychologists often refer to it as rationalization, but in neurological terms, it's a survival function. Without a coherent story of self, the human mind collapses. The brain would rather invent a lie that feels safe than face a truth that feels meaningless in therapy. Patients with delusions are rarely convinced by evidence alone. You can show them video proof that contradicts their belief and they'll still find a reason to dismiss it. That's not stubbornness. It's their brain refusing to accept a version of reality that would shatter its inner order. It's the mind saying, "I'd rather be wrong than fall apart." Rehan experienced this firsthand. His therapist showed him journal entries from days he didn't remember writing, detailed notes from his alternate days. When confronted with them, he didn't deny the handwriting or the logic of what was written. He simply said, "Maybe the other version of me wrote it." It wasn't sarcasm. It was how his mind had made peace with contradiction. Every brain, even a healthy one, performs similar tricks. When we misremember a detail and insist we're right, it's not pride, it's coherence maintenance. When we justify bad decisions or reinterpret the past to make ourselves look better, we're doing the same thing. The only difference between Rehan and the rest of us is that his brain's corrections weren't small. They were entire realities stitched together to preserve a fragile sense of order. Neuroscience shows that this instinct to create meaning is deeply embedded in human cognition. Our brains have a built-in prediction engine. Instead of reacting to reality, the brain constantly predicts what will happen next, using memories, expectations, and beliefs as a guide. Every moment, it compares what's happening with what it predicted. And when something doesn't match, it adjusts either the perception or the belief. It's efficient, but flawed. When the predictions become too rigid, or the sensory input too strange, the brain starts bending reality to fit its expectations. For Rehan, this meant that once his mind started believing in the other world, it began predicting it, and therefore reinforcing it. Each hallucination, each moment of confusion, strengthened the alternate reality's logic. Soon, both worlds had internal consistency. Both made sense, and that was the problem. His wife once asked him, "If you had to choose, which world feels more real?" He paused for a long time before answering, "The one that hurts less." That single line revealed what his brain had been doing all along, protecting him. The version of reality where he felt safe became the dominant one. The one filled with anxiety and noise became background static. But as those emotional weights shifted, so did his perception of truth, in the end. The brain doesn't care about what's objectively real. It cares about what allows it to survive, to keep functioning, to keep telling a story that feels whole. Rehan's mind had chosen coherence over consistency, peace over precision, and that choice, though invisible, is something all of us make every day in smaller ways. We forget, reinterpret, justify, and explain because our brains can't handle a world without narrative. For some, those adjustments are minor and harmless. For others, like Rehan, they become entire alternate worlds. And it's in that fragile need to make sense of chaos that the truth of the human brain lies. Not as a machine built for accuracy, but as an artist forever rewriting its own reality just to feel complete. Reality is not something we see. It's something we construct. Every sound, color, and texture we experience has already passed through the filters of memory, emotion, and expectation before we even become aware of it. That's why two people can witness the same event and walk away with two different truths, and both can swear they're right. The brain doesn't care about objectivity. It cares about survival, and survival depends on a perception that feels real. It's not one that necessarily is real. For Dr. Rehan Malik, that difference became terrifyingly clear. In the early stages of his condition, he still believed that logic could keep him safe. If I can measure it, it must be real, he told himself. So he filled his home with devices, sound recorders, cameras, light sensors, trying to prove that what he saw wasn't in his head. But the data never matched his experience. The recordings showed silence where he heard whispers, stillness where he swore something had moved. The more evidence he gathered, the less he trusted his senses. What Rehan was living through illustrated a strange truth. Perception is subjective, but subjectivity feels absolute. When the brain constructs reality, it relies on signals from our senses combined with chemical messengers, dopamine, serotonin, and glutamate, to decide what's important and what can be ignored. When those chemicals fluctuate, so does our sense of truth. Imagine two brains looking at the same sunset. One is balanced, dopamine and serotonin in harmony. It sees color, feels calm, maybe even grateful. The other is imbalanced, flooded with excess dopamine, heightening patterns, and shadows. It sees movement in the clouds, faces in the light, signs of meaning that aren't there. The same sunset, two realities. That's the foundation of subjectivity. Perception filtered through chemistry and emotion. Rehan's dopamine system, his doctors later discovered, was unusually active in the striatum, the region linked to prediction and salience. In simple terms, his brain was overvaluing irrelevant details. A flicker of light became a signal. A random sound became a warning. His mind wasn't inventing reality from scratch. It was misinterpreting the one already there, in a healthy brain. Sensory information passes through a series of checkpoints, the thalamus, cortex, and hippocampus, where it's analyzed, compared, and verified. Think of it as a fact-checking process. But when neurochemical balance breaks, that system falters. Instead of filtering noise, the brain amplifies it. Instead of dismissing coincidences, it finds meaning in them. That's how delusions begin, not as wild fantasies, but as ordinary experiences taken too seriously. For Rehan, this meant that his perception became a hall of mirrors. When his wife smiled, he didn't just see a smile. He saw hesitation, distance, something hidden. When the phone rang, he didn't just hear the sound. He felt a warning in the tone. His mind was filling in emotional blanks with imagined intent. What made it more frightening was that these impressions came with the same weight of certainty as any genuine sensory fact. To his brain, they were equally real. Science explains this through the predictive coding model of the brain. The idea that perception is not passive, but predictive. The brain doesn't wait for information. It constantly guesses what will happen next and updates itself based on incoming data. It's an efficient system, but when the predictions overpower the corrections, the mind begins to hallucinate. It stops adjusting to reality and starts bending reality to fit its expectations. Rehan's episodes followed this exact pattern. Whenever he felt anxious, his predictions became stronger than his perceptions. He expected something to go wrong, and so his brain started seeing things that confirmed it. A shadow in the hallway, a whisper behind the door, tiny signals that matched his fear. Once the brain accepted those signals as real, it stopped questioning them. His two realities were really two predictive systems running in parallel. One logical and grounded, the other emotional and distorted. The strangest part was how both worlds shared the same emotional logic. In the alternate version, everyone seemed distant and mechanical. The air felt colder, sound sharper. These weren't random distortions. They were emotional projections. His mind was coloring perception based on fear. Modern neuroscience calls this the affective coloring of reality. When emotions tint sensory input so powerfully that they redefine what's perceived, when you're happy, the world looks bright. When you're scared, shadows feel alive. When your brain stops distinguishing between those states, every feeling becomes a fact. This is why hallucinations and delusions are so convincing. They borrow the brain's most reliable signals, motion, sensory input, and memory, and combine them into something that feels unshakably true. You can't talk someone out of it because their entire biology agrees with what they're seeing. In Rehan's case, both realities were internally consistent. In one, he was a doctor losing control of his mind. In the other, he was the only sane person left in a fabricated world. To his brain, both stories made perfect sense. As the boundaries blurred, small moments began to fracture. He would reach for his coffee mug and feel the texture change mid-touch. A student's voice would echo twice, once in real time and once a half-second later, as if reality itself were replaying. These sensory mismatches weren't supernatural. They were signs of desynchronization between his auditory and visual processing centers. In healthy brains, those systems communicate instantly. In Rehan's, the signal delay was enough to create a feeling that the world was off, like a movie slightly out of sync. Such experiences reveal how fragile our sense of normal really is. Reality as we know it depends on perfect timing, balance, and agreement between billions of neurons. When that synchronization slips, even slightly, the mind begins to doubt its own world. Rehan wasn't trapped in a hallucination. He was trapped in uncertainty. And uncertainty, prolonged long enough, becomes its own form of madness. He tried to test his own perception by keeping two journals. One for the days that felt real, and one for the days that didn't. Weeks later, when he reread them, he was shocked to find no clear difference. The handwriting, the tone, even the language matched. "If I can't tell which version wrote this," he murmured, "then which version am I?" It was a chilling realization that identity itself might be as subjective as the world around him. Psychologists often say that the mind is the last place we expect betrayal. We trust our thoughts, our memories, our senses, yet they're the easiest things to deceive. The brain has no external referee, no objective outside observer to confirm what's real. It only has itself. When it falters, the entire world shifts with it. In Rehan's therapy sessions, he began to learn grounding techniques to test his perceptions, touching cold metal, focusing on his heartbeat, and counting breaths. Each exercise was designed to reconnect him to the physical, measurable world. Slowly, he started recognizing patterns. His distortions grew stronger when he was sleep-deprived, stressed, or isolated. That realization didn't cure him, but it gave him perspective. It showed him that his other reality wasn't random. It was his brain's emotional response, amplified by chemistry and belief. There's a lesson in that. We all live in slightly different versions of reality, shaped by our experiences, culture, mood, and biology. The difference is only a matter of degree. For Rehan, the gap between worlds widened until it became visible. For the rest of us, it stays narrow enough to ignore. But every time we misinterpret someone's tone, overreact to a fear, or remember a story the way we felt it, rather than how it happened, we too are living in our own small alternate realities, Rehan once said in one of his final recordings. Maybe the truth isn't one thing. Maybe reality is just the version our brains can live with. And that is the quiet tragedy and beauty of the human mind. Reality is not found. It's negotiated. Each of us builds a world inside our head, fragile, imperfect, and entirely our own. For most people, those worlds overlap enough to call it reality. But for Rian Malik, the overlap disappeared, and he was left standing between two perfectly built worlds, each asking to be believed. It started with sound, a faint tapping in the corner of the room that wouldn't stop, even after Rehan unplugged everything. Then came the whispers, not words, just the rhythm of speech, like thoughts that didn't belong to him. Some days he'd wake up in his own bed, but feel like he was still dreaming. Other days he'd look at the city from his apartment window and swear the skyline had shifted. Each small fracture went unnoticed at first, but together they began to tear the seams of his reality. Dr. Rehan Malik was a man trained to trust data. He'd spent years teaching others that the brain can deceive, that what we see isn't always what's there. But when it happened to him, that knowledge became useless. He wasn't facing illusions he could measure. He was facing two worlds that were both internally logical, both emotionally consistent, both real. And when those worlds finally collided, his mind could no longer decide which one to keep. The collapse began gradually. One evening, Rehan was in his lab reviewing neural imaging data. Everything seemed normal until he noticed that the same brain scan appeared twice. One labeled subject 03, the other subject 07. When he compared them, they were identical. He double-checked the source files, ran the system diagnostics, and confirmed that there had been no duplication. The data was unique, yet identical. His assistant looked at the same screens and saw two different scans. Rehan stared in silence. How could two people looking at the same image see two versions of it? That night, he couldn't sleep. He began questioning everything: his research, his memory, even the physical world. His thoughts became disorganized, looping in circles. If the brain creates reality, he whispered to himself, then what happens when it creates two at once? His wife found him sitting by the window at dawn, repeating the question as though it were a riddle he couldn't solve. From a clinical perspective, what Rehan was experiencing was a collapse of cognitive integration. The brain's ability to unify information from memory, senses, and emotion depends on coordination between multiple regions. The prefrontal cortex interprets logic, the limbic system processes feeling, and the parietal lobe orients us in space. When these systems lose synchronization, perception shatters. The person can still think, speak, and function, but their internal world model splits apart. What follows is confusion so deep that reality itself feels unstable. For Rehan, the two realities began merging unpredictably. He'd walk through his office and see it flicker, one version bright and familiar, the other dim, distorted, filled with quiet figures standing just beyond recognition. He would blink and they'd vanish. In his journal, he described it as like living in two dreams, both aware of the other, both insisting they're awake. Psychiatrists studying such cases describe a phenomenon called reality blending. It occurs when the mind can no longer separate internal imagination from external stimuli. Normally, the brain tags our thoughts as self-generated. That's why you know when you imagine a voice in your head that it's your own thought. Not someone else's, but under extreme stress, neurological illness, or trauma, this labeling system can fail. The brain begins interpreting its own imagination as sensory data. Thoughts become sounds, emotions become physical sensations, and memory becomes prophecy. Rehan's world was now full of these misfires. He'd hear his own inner dialogue spoken aloud. He'd feel heat on his skin when no heater was on. Once, he reached out to turn off a lamp that wasn't lit. His brain had stopped distinguishing between what was happening. and what it expected to happen. The human mind can tolerate small inconsistencies, illusions, dreams, and temporary confusion. But when those inconsistencies grow large enough, the brain panics. It tries to rebuild coherence by merging the two realities into one. That's when the hallucinations become dangerous. The mind is no longer asking, which one is real? It's declaring both are. For Rehan, that declaration came during what his doctor later called a fusion episode. He was at home, having dinner with his wife. She was telling him about a call from her mother when her voice suddenly shifted. Not in pitch, but in tone, as if another person was speaking through her. Rehan froze. His eyes darted between her face and a reflection in the mirror behind her, and in that reflection, she wasn't moving her lips. The room tilted. The mirror version of his wife continued speaking while the real one sat in silence, watching him panic. In that instant, both realities overlapped. His brain couldn't decide which was authentic, so it believed both. He screamed. The plate fell, shattering on the floor. His wife rushed toward him, but all he could see were two versions of her. One coming from the table, one from the mirror. "Which one are you?" he shouted. She tried to hold his face, but he pulled away, terrified. Later, he wouldn't remember what happened next, only that everything went black. When he regained consciousness, he was in a hospital bed, 4 lines in his arm. The sterile smell of disinfectant in the air. The doctor explained that he'd suffered a psychotic break brought on by stress, sleep deprivation, and neurochemical imbalance. But Rehan didn't believe it. "If it was all in my head," he asked, "why do I still remember it more clearly than this room?" That question goes to the heart of how fragile our sense of reality truly is. The human brain doesn't store experiences based on truth. It stores them based on emotional weight. That's why a dream can feel more vivid than a normal day, or why trauma feels permanent even when time passes. The more emotion an event carries, the deeper it's etched into neural circuits. For Rehan, the hallucinated reality carried just as much emotion as the physical one. His neurons didn't discriminate. Psychologists studying similar cases often note that recovery depends not on erasing the alternate reality, but on integrating it, teaching the brain to recognize both versions as parts of the same experience. Denying one only deepens the divide. It's like trying to cure a wound by pretending it isn't there in therapy. Rehan was guided through what his doctor called dual awareness training. He was encouraged to describe both realities in detail, the smells, the sounds, the feelings, without judging them as real or false. Slowly, the exercise helped him see that both worlds followed emotional logic. The other version of reality always appeared when he was exhausted, anxious, or doubting himself. It was his brain's way of expressing inner tension, a language of fear spoken through perception. That realization was painful but liberating. "My brain isn't broken," he said one day during a session. "It's just showing me my fears in another form." His therapist nodded. "Exactly. Both realities come from the same source. You?" From that moment, Rehan began to recover. The episodes still came, but now he recognized them. When the lights flickered, when a voice whispered, when the world bent slightly out of shape, he would close his eyes and remind himself, "This is my mind trying to make sense of something it can't explain." By naming the experience, he regained control. The collision of two worlds had nearly destroyed him. But it also gave him a deeper understanding of the brain's fragility. He began writing about it, turning his experience into lectures for psychology students. "The brain doesn't fail when it creates two realities," he told them. "It's doing its job, protecting you from pain, confusion, or fear. The tragedy is when we start believing one world must erase the other." His story became a testament to how thin the boundary between sanity and madness truly is. When those boundaries collapse, the mind doesn't fall apart in chaos. It tries to build order out of fragments. That's what the human brain always does. It adapts, it compensates, it believes. And in that belief lies both its strength and its vulnerability. In the end, Rehan's two worlds didn't disappear. They learned to coexist. Some days, the shadows still whispered. Sometimes reflections still lagged. But now he understood that they weren't signs of another dimension. They were echoes of his own mind. reminders of the brain's endless effort to turn uncertainty into meaning. And perhaps that's what every human mind does. In its own quiet way, it balances between what is real and what must be real. Never certain, always constructing. Always choosing the version of reality it can bear to live in. Healing didn't arrive as a sudden revelation for Dr. Rehan Malik. It came slowly. Quietly, the way dawn replaces darkness, one shade at a time. There were no miracles, no instant clarity, only the steady, patient work of teaching his brain to trust again. After months of confusion, fear, and self-doubt, he had learned one crucial truth. If the mind can build two realities, it can also learn to bring them back together. The process began with acceptance. Rehan's first instinct had always been to fight what was happening, to suppress the hallucinations, deny the distortions, and force himself into what he believed was the real world. But the harder he resisted, the worse the episodes became. His therapist, Dr. Nima Siddiqui, explained why. "The brain doesn't respond well to war," she said during one of their sessions. "When you attack a part of it, it defends itself. Healing starts when you stop treating your perception as an enemy." Instead of questioning which reality was real, Rehan began observing both with curiosity. Each time his environment shifted or a sound appeared out of nowhere, he described it calmly in his notebook. The color of the walls, the temperature in the air, the feeling in his body. Over time, he noticed patterns, how the distortions always intensified when he was stressed, how they faded when he felt grounded or rested. Slowly, his journal became not a record of madness, but a map of his own healing. Neuroscience calls this approach mindful integration. It's rooted in the principle of neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to rewire itself through experience. When we learn, reflect, or heal, we're not just changing thoughts. We're physically reshaping neural pathways. Each time Rehan recognized a false perception and calmly corrected it, his brain was building new connections, stronger, more coherent, more stable. It's easy to forget how adaptable the brain truly is. For centuries, scientists believed that once damaged, neural circuits couldn't recover. But modern research has overturned that belief. The human brain is remarkably flexible. It can repair broken links, form new ones, and even assign new functions to old regions. Therapy, meditation, and medication all work by harnessing that flexibility. For Rehan, mindfulness meditation became his anchor. He began each morning with 10 minutes of focused breathing, training his attention to return to a single point whenever it drifted. The goal wasn't to silence the noise, but to observe it without reaction. When his two realities began to blur, he learned to ground himself using touch and sound. The feel of the floor under his feet, the rhythm of his heartbeat, the sound of his breath, these physical sensations gave his brain reliable input, something it could trust even when perception faltered. But mindfulness alone wasn't enough. His recovery also relied on chemistry. With medical guidance, Rehan started a treatment plan that balanced his dopamine and serotonin levels, the same neurotransmitters that had once distorted his perception. Within weeks, the hallucinations softened. They didn't vanish entirely, but they lost their authority. The voices became whispers, and the alternate world faded into the background. He described it as like turning down the volume on a second radio station that's been playing in my head. Medication corrected the imbalance, but therapy gave that correction meaning. Dr. Nima helped him rebuild the emotional foundation that his disorder had shaken apart. "Your brain doesn't just want accuracy," she told him. "It wants safety. If your mind believes the world is dangerous or unpredictable, it will keep creating alternate versions to make sense of that fear. So healing means teaching them that you're safe again." That insight struck Rehan deeply. For years, he had viewed his condition as a failure, a malfunction in the circuitry of his brain. But now, he began to see it differently. His mind hadn't betrayed him. It had overprotected him. The other world wasn't random insanity. His brain attempted to shield him from anxiety, loneliness, and guilt. Understanding that gave him compassion for himself. Over time, his two realities began to merge. The alternate world didn't vanish overnight. It simply became less vivid, less necessary. The voices that once frightened him became faint echoes, reminding him that his brain could still wander, but always return home. He no longer tried to erase that part of himself. He integrated it. He began saying, "That's my mind testing me," instead of "that's my mind breaking." From an educational perspective, Rehan's recovery is a powerful demonstration of how therapy and neuroscience complement each other. The biological side, neurotransmitters, brain circuits, and medication, restores balance. The psychological side, mindfulness, emotional safety, and self-compassion, teaches the brain how to maintain that balance. Both are essential because the brain isn't just an organ. It's a storyteller. It must learn a new story to believe in before it can heal. In lectures to his students after recovery, Rehan would explain it like this: imagine your brain as a city. During illness, some roads are blocked, and traffic keeps rerouting the wrong way. Medication clears the roads, but therapy teaches the drivers not to panic when they see a detour. Healing is both construction and education. He also learned to respect rest, something he'd once dismissed as weakness. Sleep became his greatest medicine. Neuroscience supports this. During deep sleep, the brain performs essential maintenance, clearing toxins and strengthening new neural connections. In patients recovering from perceptual disorders, consistent sleep stabilizes emotional processing and restores cognitive coherence. For Rehan, good sleep meant quieter nights and fewer overlaps between his two worlds. Months later, he visited the hospital wing where he had once been treated. He met new patients, some just beginning to experience the same dual realities he once had. They looked lost, frightened, and unsure of what was real. Rehan sat beside one of them, a young woman who said she could see two versions of her mother, one kind, one cruel. Rehan didn't tell her she was wrong. He simply said, "Your brain is trying to protect you. Don't hate it. Learn what it's trying to say." It was advice rooted not in theory, but in lived experience. He had learned that empathy itself could be a form of medicine, and understanding rather than argument was what brought fractured minds back together. The scientific side of his recovery fascinated him too. He began publishing papers on perceptual integration therapy, combining neuroscience with mindfulness. His work emphasized that mental health isn't about silencing symptoms, but teaching the brain how to interpret them correctly. His central argument was simple: perception is flexible, and flexibility is hope. Years later, when asked if he ever fully recovered, Rehan smiled. "I don't think healing means going back to who you were," he said. "It means learning to live peacefully with every version of yourself." His journey taught a profound lesson about the human brain, that it's not a perfect machine designed for truth, but a living, adaptive system built for survival and meaning. It can break, yes, but it can also rebuild itself in extraordinary ways. In the end, the two realities that once tore him apart became the reason he understood life more deeply. One showed him how fragile perception could be. The other showed him how resilient the mind truly is. Together, they formed a single, integrated truth that healing is not forgetting what broke you. It's teaching your brain that it can hold both pain and peace and still choose to move forward.